We are going to be talking about the Disney Gallery. Of course, this series is focusing on The Mandalorian, and we were talking about the latest episode that actually launched last Friday or was made available last Friday on Disney Plus called Score. As the name obviously suggests, we're obviously going to be talking about the music and the score for The Mandalorian. Now, Eric has mentioned previously that there is kind of some controversy about the score itself. I haven't had too many issues with the score. I think the score is actually quite good. And I love movie music just in general. I'm a big orchestral movie soundtrack buff. I recommended and talked about last episode. There's a great place called La La Land Records. They do a lot of limited release stuff actually on CDs. That's right, folks, CDs, physical media. But I have a very extensive collection actually on CD of movie scores. It includes everything, obviously, from the obvious classics, the reference to Star Wars, like, of course, John Williams' Star Wars movies, but also a lot of other more eclectic things. I have, scores for things like Die Hard, and I have scores for things like Heat and all kinds of other kinds of films, because I love all kinds of movie music. So anyhow, enough droning on about that. We want to talk about just our initial thoughts, our overviews before getting too deep dive into this. So tell me, Eric, what was your initial impressions of this particular episode of the Disney Gallery Mandalorian score?
Well, I found it very interesting. As I mentioned in the intro, I was involved as a bass player in bands for a number of years, numerous bands. And so I do have quite a bit of experience recording in a professional studio. And I also had created my own home studio at one point. Unfortunately, my home studio now is terribly out of date because the main mixer I have for it uses FireWire, and none of the new computers use FireWire anymore. But aside from that, it's something that I had quite a passion for many, many years, and it's a tough gig. It's tough being a musician, and it's tough recording. It's tough performing, and it's tough composing. It's tough when you write your own music. I actually did dabble a little bit in writing my own music as well during that time period. So this episode does have I guess a special place in my heart because of that, because of all those trials and tribulations, and I found it very interesting because I would say that this is probably the most different episode, not just in terms of content, but in terms of focus. Because one of the nice things about this episode is there's this tremendous focus on the composer. And in fact, many of the other roundtable participants that we've seen in every single other episode, at least once, they're not in this. A lot of the directors are not in this at all. A lot of the visual arts people and things like that we've seen in pretty much every other episode, they're not in this. The actors, they're not really in this either, other than when they show, the finished product. They really focused on the composer, which I thought was really interesting because I knew absolutely nothing about this man. And it was really interesting to see his process and also see his style. I was a little, I wouldn't say taken aback, but I was a little bit surprised about, just I guess sort of his manner and kind of the way that he was. He's certainly not John Williams, and I don't think he tries to be John Williams. And they mentioned that in this particular episode, that they were definitely trying to go for something different. And that's where I think a lot of the controversy has come from, is that this is a very different score than your typical Star Wars films. Even I think a lot of the side projects, the music is different. Although we did mention on a previous episode, we were talking about the animated Droids cartoon. And of course, that had a very different intro, that was actually done by one of the members of the police. And Stuart Copeland, I think, right? The drummer for the Police is the one who composed that. And that was very different. I remember even as a kid thinking, wow, this doesn't sound like Star Wars. This is kind of like a weird kind of trippy quasi rock song or whatever that style exactly was. So in a lot of ways, it feels like The Mandalorian is kind of taking from some of that, of those previous Star Wars television projects. Which I think Jon Favreau is, in a lot of ways, it's intentional. And he does mention that in this this episode. He does talk about that, how they were trying to be kind of different. And I do want to acknowledge some comments from the Rogues Gallery. James, glad to have you back. He says, "Evening, gentlemen. Since we are discussing orchestral music, I thought I would highbrow it a little in my greetings." So we appreciate that. We keep it all high class here, right, on Retro Rogues Live. And then Matt, my friend from Portronics Film Productions, says, "Looking forward to tonight's show." Matt, I'm glad you were able to come on for a little bit and say hi. And I do want to give a shout out that's actually for the both of us, because we recently completed all the principal photography on a short film project, and we have sent our all of that film to our editor. So that's hopefully something I'll be able to talk about in the future, about that project that Matt and I are working on, because hopefully that will actually be done very soon. But Dave, what were some of your thoughts as far as sort of the, like I said, like you mentioned that I've talked about some of the controversy that apparently we're not aware of, but there are people that absolutely hate this score. But that was a key point that they talked about in this series, that they were deliberately trying to do something different.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly have enjoyed the music for The Mandalorian. I haven't had a lot of issues or complaints or problems with it at all. But I think, in all honesty, I think most of us as Star Wars fans by now should be used to music being slightly different, whether you're talking about, obviously, a lot of the music from Clone Wars, or you're talking about the music from things such as, even Rogue One. Rogue One doesn't sound like a classic. I mean, it gets there, but it starts so different because it doesn't have the crawl and the music's different. So for me, when The Mandalorian starts, I didn't have a lot of issues with the music, and I quite liked the music. I was a little shocked that the main theme is that basically played on a recorder. That was kind of crazy, I remember.
I was very surprised about that. I was like, "Wow, that's pretty funny, almost."
Yeah, and when I think of a recorder, I just think of kids in like middle school and stuff learning basic music, with a recorder. So I was kind of shocked to see that the main theme that we hear so much of in The Mandalorian, which sounds sort of kind of otherworldly, but also kind of westerny at the same time, was basically just played on a recorder. That was kind of a little stunning and shocking for me. I wasn't too terribly familiar with the composer either, but like I said, I quite like the music. So my initial impressions was I found this ought to be terribly fascinating. As I've mentioned previously on the show, I love any kind of process behind the scenes stuff. Some of the best behind the scenes things that's kind of like what the Disney Gallery Mandalorian series is like is, for example, like when they released a couple of years ago, they released, I think it's called Alien Quadrilogy or whatever it's called. They released up until that point all the Aliens films that included what was the name of the last one? It's so bad because I had a hat with the logo on it. But anyhow, it was the last one that had Sigourney Weaver in, essentially. Those actually each one came with a bonus disc, and those bonus discs had some of the most amazing, interesting, in-depth sort of documentaries about the creation of those various films. For example, the Alien 3 one is so terribly interesting because of all the controversy of what happened with Alien 3 and how we eventually wound up with the film that was made. And then I also always recommend that people check out, if you can get a hold of it, the Daredevil, the theatrical release Blu-ray, had a really great documentary on it. And it's just so crazy to see how much they went through with that. At one point, they talk about in that documentary about how one of the producers was stuck in traffic, and he had a phone conference going, and all these executives were arguing about the color red and basically running a couple seconds of Ben Affleck in costume back and forth, really losing their minds and concerned that the color red wasn't going to work. They thought it was too cartoonish and whatever. So it's really interesting, just all these behind the scene things. But this is the first one I've seen that really gets this in depth with a composer who's done a score. Now, of course, obviously, we've had John Williams on some of the Star Wars, DVD, Blu-ray extra type things, but I've never seen one that's quite this in depth. But I found it very, very interesting, and I quite enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, as you mentioned, I didn't know much about. Well, actually, I didn't know anything about this composer. This is the first time I even saw his name, and I have it up there on the screen for everyone. I can pronounce his first name, Ludwig. I believe the last name is Göransson. Göransson, I'm not sure, but I didn't know anything about his work or anything like that. So, I was completely unfamiliar with him. So it was. I went into this with almost a completely blank slate, not knowing anything. I was surprised about the recorder as well. In fact, as a kid, I remember learning about the recorder in a music class in like second grade. One of my daughters has been doing recorder lessons in school. That, just like you said, I associate the recorder with that, with like an instrument that you use to actually teach, children, the large groups of children that are not necessarily even musically inclined, how to teach them about music. And so it's interesting to me that's an integral part of the score. The very sort of distinctive opening sort of the opening music for the Mandalorian. That do 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 do. I mean, that's all done basically on a recorder. It's fascinating to me. Although one of the recorders he uses is much more elaborate than the one that you see the little kids use and stuff like that. But yeah, I went into it with a lot of a blank slate in terms of not knowing anything about this man. And I think it's really interesting, again, that unlike so many of the other episodes of The Mandalorian, where we kind of see the same faces over and over again, this is really the first time you see him in this series. And the series is really just all about him. They really don't get into a lot of the other folks that were involved with the creation of the music for The Mandalorian. It's really all about him. And so they show his process of how it is that he composes. They do show his interaction with the orchestra. They show his actual mixing board, which is crazy. I've never seen a configuration like that before, because unlike a traditional mixing board that you have sort of, people think of where you have it sort of like a table and it's in front of you and you mix with it. He has a mixing wall with all these different mixers that can get him all these incredibly unique sounds, which is a little bit discouraging as someone who is interested in that kind of stuff in terms of producing music and things like that, because I'm like, wow, I don't know if I would ever be able to get a collection of mixers like that. I'm happy to have the one Mackie mixer I have, and then I recently purchased this little mixer here for the show that I've been trying to test out and things like that. And that's about the extent of it for me. Oh, I've got that Firewire mixer that I can't really use anymore. I've got that. But he had a wall of mixers, and I've never really seen a configuration quite like that. I've certainly seen professional studios, where they do have all sorts of equipment on the walls, but not this vast number of mixers like he had. So he's got this sort of definitely his own unique sort of style in terms of the way that he creates music and also the way that he records it, which means that a lot of those sounds are probably pretty unique and difficult to duplicate. And it seems like he's grounded a lot in analog. He's not a big like digital computer type of guy. In fact, one of the things that he emphasized was that his primary instrument is the guitar. That's what he first learned on, and he has this really old Roland guitar synthesizer that he uses with the guitar. And he was talking about how it's a really unique machine because it's so rare, and it's from the 70s. And again, it gives sort of that warmer analog sound that's virtually impossible to duplicate on a computer. So there's always that big riff, by the way, when it comes to musicians and composers, people like that, as far as people that really embrace the new technology, as far as what computers offer, and those that are more analog. And he does seem to be more sort of on the analog side, which is kind of interesting because this show, as we've talked about, has so many technological innovations, and is so technology heavy. And yet he was emphasizing a lot of the more analog approach that he has to the creation of music and also in the recording of music, which I found to be an interesting contrast to the rest of the show.
It was interesting. And, they didn't really touch on it at all, but when he was over at his mixing wall and he was messing with it for half a second, it made me think of all those science fiction films where there's the computer wall that someone's throwing all the random dials and switches on, and there's lights everywhere, and it doesn't really make any sense to any normal human being, but somehow the person who's operating it, because it's their spaceship or whatever, they understand what's going on there. It made me think of that, and I was surprised they didn't take a moment to show, like, even just a little snippet of Han Solo at the what was it, when he was having problems with the Falcon and Empire, trying to get the what was it, the light speed engine to work correctly, and he said plug 3PO into the hyperdrive and figure out what's wrong with it. I was surprised it didn't show that just him standing there flipping switches for half a second, just for the funs and giggles of it.
Well, I think he's pretty serious about what he does. You know what I mean? I think that he definitely has at least in this episode, I get that indication of a lighthearted nature, but I think he's very serious about his job. You know what I mean? And very serious about his equipment. I know how musicians are and producers, music producers are with their equipment and their music and all that stuff. They take it very seriously. You know what I mean? Especially when you've collected that diverse amount of equipment that he has.
And James is nice enough to point out that Alien Resurrection was the film I was having a hard time thinking of the name of. Thank you. Yes, Alien Resurrection. One of my most infamous claims to fame is I was in, was it Tomart's Action Figure Digest? I think Tomart's Action Figure Digest was Star Gods back in the late 90s, and we were talking about the action figure line that was supposed to happen but didn't happen. But there's a picture of the founding members of Conquest Studios, which was Scott Clark, Dean Zachary, and myself. And I was wearing an Alien Resurrection hat. It's one of the few pictures of me in a magazine, and I'm wearing an Alien Resurrection hat. I'll let you all just kind of digest that. I had got the hat for free and was very excited about the film. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but Scott Clark and I are huge fans of the Aliens franchise just in general. We often talk about, Ridley Scott's, masterpiece. It is the original Alien film, and of course James Cameron's Aliens. And I am a huge fan, actually, of Alien 3 for all the wrong reasons. That's what was why I like Alien 3. But anyhow, enough about that. We're supposed to be talking about Star Wars, right? But anyhow, yes, Alien Resurrection, that was the one I was trying to think of. But those documentaries are really interesting. That's the point, as I continue to ramble on incessantly about something that has nothing to do with Star Wars. But no, my overall takeaway from this, it was really interesting. I enjoyed sort of the focus they actually spent with the composer. That was the thing I really liked. It's just the fact that they just really focused on him and his particular contribution and his method. While I like the round table nature of the other films, I found myself kind of going, no, it'd be kind of cool if we'd spend a little bit more time with just Filoni or just Favreau and why exactly, why The Mandalorian, why this way, why now? I know those sound like completely silly, stupid questions that I know have been kind of answered, but I just enjoyed this kind of more intimate portrait. For example, talking about Jon Favreau, I keep seeing Jon Favreau drawing on shows, and no one really talks about the fact that this man can draw. For example, if you pay close attention, he's actually drawing The Mandalorian during one of the scoring sessions. I believe that is him who's actually drawing. And then in his one of his episodes of his chef series that's on Netflix, when he actually goes and actually visits with Robert Rodriguez has a sketchbook, or is it? I forget. Anyhow, they start drawing in this sketchbook. And it's just, I just find it really interesting because no one really talks about the fact that Favreau is really into cartooning and art, but I think he is. and
I've never heard that before. I didn't catch that scene that you're talking about at all.
It's real brief, but he's actually drawing the Mandalorian while they're doing the scoring session. It looks like it's on a yellow pad and note paper. It might possibly be Filoni, but I definitely I think it's Favreau who's actually the one who's doing the drawing. And like I said, he I know he's one episode of his chef series on Netflix, not the movie, but the sort of cooking show that he does with one of the guys that trained him for the movie Chef. And there's a scene when they go and they visit Robert Rodriguez, and they're actually making pizzas of all things. By the way, highly recommend that if you haven't seen that Chef series on Netflix. It's really cool. But Robert Rodriguez is really big into like fire oven pizzas, and he makes all these crazy pizzas and stuff. So they're making pizzas on that particular episode, and I think it's Rodriguez that has the sketchbook, or Favreau has a sketchbook. But in that one, Favreau actually draws, and he draws this crazy dragon thing or whatever, and it's really kind of cool. And that's the thing. I enjoyed the more intimate's not even maybe not the right word. Sort of the more solitary focus on this one particular creator and their one particular contribution. And I kind of like to have one of those just with Favreau and just Filoni too. But that
Well,
again,
I agree. I agree with you that this episode stands out because of the way that it does focus on Ludwig. It does focus on the composer, and it totally stands out from the other episodes. The other episodes, to me, seem to have a very sort of set format, almost formulaic, and this one is very different. It really is a spotlight episode, so it really does stand out. So it's kind of interesting if you haven't actually been liking some of the other episodes, maybe you dropped out after episode 3 or something like that, you just didn't like the style, this would be an interesting one to check out, because if you didn't like it, one's very different, and it very much is a spotlight. But I will say, as far as Favreau and Filoni, I mean, they're kind of spotlighted in every single episode. I mean, they really are, actually both of them, I think, personally, are highlighted in almost every single episode. There was a big Filoni moment in this episode where he was talking about working with George. And again, I use the term George Lucas loyalists, the Lucas loyalists. And Filoni, once again, was praising George Lucas and talking about how he used to work on music with Lucas, and emphasizing the fact that a lot of the things that they're doing on The Mandalorian are just like what George Lucas taught him. I love it how he always throws in things like that. He's almost like the George Lucas historian, and he's always throwing stuff like that in, because obviously he worked with George Lucas in a very personal way for a number of years. And Favreau doesn't have that. Favreau doesn't have that pedigree where he actually was at Lucasfilm in the era of George Lucas. So I think it's kind of neat when Filoni will come up with those little stories, because he does it all the time, where he comes up with these little stories about working with George Lucas and sort of comparing what they're doing today to what they did with Lucas in the past. It always seems to be that Filoni brings up the point that, yeah, it's just like just like how George and I used to do things. It's exactly the same kind of process, which I think is really, really neat, because he seems to really be advancing that. Incidentally, one thing that he did that I don't know if you noticed or not, Dave, but I noticed it glaringly, was Filoni was talking about the different kind of Star Wars fans. It actually had to do with a little bit of discussion about the people that did not like the music for The Mandalorian at first. And the composer was making the point that a lot of people that hated it in the beginning, by like say episode 4 or 5, they were starting to like it. Like they kind of switched gears, because he did acknowledge that controversy that a lot of people hated the score when it first came out. And Filoni started talking about how people, have these sort of expectations because of the eras that they grew up in. So, there's people like myself who grew up in the original trilogy era. There are people later on that grew up during, he acknowledged, the expanded universe era. And I've met a lot of fans like that who basically, during that big glut where there were no Star Wars films, they became fans based on the expanded universe. So he gave a shout out to them. Then, of course, he talked about the prequel fans, people who grew up on the prequels. I've met people like that. And that's where that was their original Star Wars. They grew up going to the prequel films as a little kid. And then he acknowledged the people that are into Clone Wars. And there is like this section of rabid Star Wars fandom that's about the Clone Wars. But you know what he didn't mention? He didn't mention anything about Disney Wars. Did you see that, Dave? He didn't mention a thing about it.
I did notice that he didn't mention anything about sort of that current new era really at all. That wasn't missed on me. I did notice that. So
And also, I have to say this is I don't know if we were at that point, but this is my favorite episode because Kathleen Kennedy's not in it. She does not appear in this episode for one scene. They don't have her at the round table. They just have Filoni and Favre and Ludwig. They don't. She's not involved at all, which I noticed that as well. Which I was like, finally, because I honestly don't know what she was contributing in earlier episodes. I just don't. And there's all sorts of rumors of infighting between Favre and Kennedy as far as for creative control over the direction of Lucasfilm in general, and certainly this show. I think certainly this show, there's something there. There's some sort of conflict going on within Lucasfilm over the creative control of this show.
well, I don't know if that for certain, but I did notice that, as you stated, that Filoni just kind of skip over the newer era of Star Wars films. That was very noticeable to me. And again, like I said, like I kind of like, just to be on the record again, I kind of like Force Awakens, and there's some elements of Rise of Skywalker that I think are interesting. And of course, I love.
Well, you mentioned so. you and I both like Rogue One. Rogue One.
Yeah,
and you did mention how there's a difference in terms of music, because there was some controversy with the music of Rogue One. I remember there was a Star Wars a podcast that I was really into, and I used to really like watching these guys. And one of the things that kind of got me away from watching them was they were just really, really trashed the score of Rogue One. And what I got from that, of course, was that, a lot of that criticism was coming from, well, it's not John Williams. Well, it's like, well, John Williams did not compose this. So trying to pretend to be John Williams, to me, would be terrible. You know what I mean? That would be awful. It seems to me that a lot of these new composers that come into Star Wars, they do have to kind of acknowledge that, but they also, they need to they definitely need to get beyond that, because nobody's John Williams, right? I mean, nobody is John Williams. He's a legendary composer. He's probably going to go down in history with Beethoven. You know what I mean, Dave?
Yes, I would agree. And of course, Rogue One, the score was by Michael Giacchino, which, a lot of people have probably recognized some of his music from things like The Incredibles. Of course, he did the score for Speed Racer. He did the score for the newer of the J.J. Abrams Star Trek films. I quite like Michael Giacchino's music, so I didn't have a lot of issues with the score for Rogue One. To me, it felt like Star Wars in the right moments, but felt kind of new in the right moments too, because it should feel like that classic era of Star Wars, but it should feel like a different story, because we're not really dealing with sort of the Jedi and a lot of the other elements that kind of give it a more mystical kind of sound, or magical kind of sound is sort of the way I think of it anyway. That's probably incorrect, but that's just how my mind personally puts it together. Which actually, Michael Giacchino, for people who are familiar, the film Cloverfield doesn't really have much of a score per se, because it's supposed to be sort of a found footage film. But one of the things that's interesting about the original Cloverfield is basically in the end credits, and if you actually do a search, you can actually get, quote unquote, the score for Cloverfield, which is just sort of that, Godzilla B movie, sci-fi monster score kind of music that actually plays at the end of the film when the film actually ends. And that's by Michael Giacchino. And that's actually really cool. It's called Roar. So like I said, I'm a huge fan of movie music, and I could go on about this forever. So.
Yeah, well, my point is that I think I definitely agree with Ludwig's approach that and also Favre said this, is that they knew they couldn't be just exactly like the rest of Star Wars. And my point is that there's only one John Williams, so why even try? So I feel like the criticism for the most part it's not legitimate. You know what I mean? Because you kind of have to do something different to do some sort of cookie cutter, watered down version of John Williams. I don't think would have been good. And also, Favre mentioned that, of course, this particular series is supposed to be inspired by the things that inspired Lucas, and that's things like those old samurai movies, westerns, that kind of stuff. And I think we talked about that in our reviews of the Mandalorian series, Dave, that we felt that was one of the good things about the score was it definitely gave you a little bit more of that sort of western feel to it, a little less of that stargazing orchestral stuff that I guess John Williams does.
Yeah, no, I would totally. We, like you said, we brought that up before, and we discussed that quite a bit on the show when we were actually reviewing the episodes of The Mandalorian specifically. And like I said, I really like the score for The Mandalorian. I think it fits incredibly well, and I do like the fact that they did take a different approach, and they did, kind of look at it in the way in which they did, because it doesn't not only does it obviously give the show its own particular sound, but it does kind of, steer away from that risk of, oh, well, this is just someone trying to do a John Williams knockoff, But it's so funny because there's so many great music that's inspired by John Williams and inspired by Star Wars. It's so beautiful and so cool, too, that is orchestral. I think about David Arnold's score for Stargate, for example. But no, there's all kinds of, just, I don't know. I agree with what they did. And it was very interesting to see this again. The word I keep coming up with is intimate, because they're mostly just dealing with just the composer. I just found it all very, very interesting.
Yeah. No, it stands out. It's a standout episode. There's no doubt about it. Stylistically, in terms of the content, obviously in terms of the focus, it really is a standout episode. It's much different than the rest of the series.
Very cool. Well, that's all I've got to say about this. Do you have anything else that you want to add?
No, other than I would say, as I mentioned before, if you kind of didn't like this series before and maybe you had some issues with it, this is a very different episode, and this might be one worth giving a try. The next episode coming up, we've got one episode left to review, and that one is called Connections. So that'll be interesting because I don't know exactly what that means. Do you know what that means, Dave?
I would assume that we're going to talk about how The Mandalorian connects back to not just the original Star Wars and Boba Fett, for example, but I think they might give us a little bit of information, for example, about the saber that Moff Gideon has that connects back to the Clone Wars. I think that's what they mean. They're going to talk about how this sort of, plays into sort of, classic Star Wars lore. And I'm curious to see, too, if they actually bring up the expanded universe, since Filoni brought it up. I wonder if they're going to talk about...
Yeah, that was nice. I have to say that was nice.